The acrid stench of rotting flesh mingles with the humid jungle air. Somewhere in the darkness, a man screams, a sound that cuts through the night like a blade, then abruptly stops. The silence that follows is somehow worse than the screaming. This is not a scene from hell. This is World War II in the Pacific Theater, where war transformed men into monsters and survival meant crossing lines that should never be crossed. What you're about to hear are documented accounts from military tribunals, survivor testimonies, and classified files that remain sealed for decades. These are not stories of heroism or glory. These are the darkest chapters of human conflict, stories of cannibalism, torture, and the complete breakdown of military discipline. Prepare yourself. There are no heroes in these stories, only victims, predators, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The B-24 Liberator's engines screamed as anti-aircraft shells exploded around the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage with the sound of ripping metal. Inside, 9 American airmen felt their stomachs drop as the plane lurched violently to starboard. "We're going down," the pilot shouted over the deafening roar of failing engines. The crew had seconds to make a choice that would determine who lived and who would face a fate worse than death. 8 men bailed out over the jungle-covered island of Chichijima. One man, the pilot, made a split-second decision that saved his life. He stayed with the aircraft until it cleared the island, then parachuted into the Pacific Ocean. That pilot was George Herbert Walker Bush, future 41st President of the United States. The 8 men who landed on Chichijima were captured within hours. Japanese soldiers dragged them through the dense undergrowth, their boots squelching in the mud, to a makeshift prison camp. The sound of their captors' voices carried a tone the Americans couldn't understand, but the malice was unmistakable. What happened next defied every convention of warfare. The Japanese didn't just want information. They wanted to break these men completely. Bamboo spikes, sharpened to needle points, were driven under fingernails. The American screams echoed through the jungle canopy as their captors demanded intelligence about Allied positions. When bamboo wasn't enough, they turned to waterboarding, forcing gallons of filthy water down the prisoners' throats until they vomited and gasped for air. The stench of fear-induced sweat mixed with blood and vomit created an atmosphere of pure terror. But these American airmen held their silence. They gave up nothing. Their courage would cost them everything. When the Japanese realized they would extract no useful intelligence, they made a decision that crossed every boundary of human decency. On the orders of Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, the 8 Americans were executed by beheading. But death was not the end of their ordeal. What happened next was discovered only when Allied forces retook the island. The evidence was undeniable: knife marks on bones, human remains scattered around cooking fires, and the testimony of Japanese soldiers themselves. Admiral Kenizo Mori later testified that their chef had pierced the Americans' livers with bamboo sticks and cooked them with soy sauce and vegetables. The liver, in certain Japanese military beliefs, was considered the seat of courage and power. By consuming it, they believed they would absorb their enemy's strength. But it wasn't just the livers. Flesh was carved from the corpses and distributed among the Japanese garrison. The smell of cooking human meat drifted through the camp for days. In another incident that defied comprehension, 2 American B-29 crewmen were shot down and captured. They were told they were being taken to a hospital for treatment of their injuries. The reality was far more sinister. At Kyushu University, these men became subjects in medical experiments that would have made Nazi doctors proud. One airman was injected with massive quantities of salt water to observe the effects on human physiology. His body convulsed as his blood pressure spiked and his organs began to fail. The second airman was strapped to an operating table while fully conscious. Japanese medical students watched as surgeons cut open his chest cavity and removed one of his lungs. They wanted to study how the respiratory system would function with only one lung. The sound of the bone saw cutting through ribs, the wet sucking noise as the lung was extracted, the victim's gurgling attempts to breathe. These sounds haunted the medical students who witnessed the procedures. Some of the organs removed during these experiments were later consumed by hungry Japanese soldiers. Human flesh had become just another source of protein in their twisted worldview. The Japanese Suzuki Unit had been deployed to the mountainous jungles of the southern Philippines with enough supplies for several weeks. But as Allied forces cut their supply lines, these soldiers found themselves trapped in a green hell of humidity, disease, and starvation. The jungle was merciless. Mosquitoes swarmed in black clouds. their constant buzzing driving men to the edge of madness. Leeches attached themselves to every exposed piece of skin, swelling with blood until they dropped off, leaving infected wounds behind. The stench of rotting vegetation and human waste permeated everything. As malaria and dysentery decimated their ranks, the surviving Japanese soldiers faced a choice: surrender and face dishonor, or find alternative sources of protein. They chose cannibalism. The night raids. Under cover of darkness, Japanese soldiers would creep into Filipino villages. The sound of their boots on wooden floors, the creak of bamboo walls, the sharp intake of breath from a victim who realized too late what was happening. They would strike their victims unconscious with rifle butts, the sickening crack of wood against skull echoing in the night. The unconscious villagers would be dragged back to the Japanese camp, where they would be butchered like livestock. The process was methodical and horrifying. Flesh would be carved from still-living victims, the sound of knives scraping against bone mixing with the victim's screams. The meat would be boiled with whatever vegetables they could find, or left to cure in the tropical sun, attracting clouds of flies that added their own nauseating buzz to the camp's symphony of horror. When American forces finally overran the Suzuki Unit's position, they found a scene from a nightmare. Human bones littered the ground like discarded chicken bones after a feast. Strips of human flesh still hung from makeshift drying racks. The smell of decomposing human remains was so overwhelming that hardened combat veterans vomited at the sight. 9 members of the Suzuki Unit were sentenced to death for their crimes. But investigators knew that many more had participated in the cannibalistic feeding frenzy that had sustained the unit for months. In the dense jungles of Papua New Guinea, Japanese forces had captured hundreds of Allied prisoners: Indians, Australians, British, and others. As their situation became desperate, these captors implemented what can only be described as a systematic program of cannibalism. Pakistani corporal testimony revealed the most chilling detail. For approximately 100 days, Japanese soldiers selected one prisoner each day to be killed and eaten. 100 human beings, consumed methodically over more than 3 months. Each evening, as the tropical sun set through the jungle canopy, the prisoners would huddle together, knowing that one of them would not see another dawn. The Japanese would walk among them, pointing at their chosen victim with the casual indifference of someone selecting livestock for slaughter. The chosen prisoner would be dragged to a small hut where their screams would echo through the jungle for what seemed like hours. Survivors reported that the victims were flayed alive, their skin peeled away while they were still conscious, their flesh carved away piece by piece. The sound of knives cutting through muscle and sinew, the wet tearing of flesh being separated from bone, the victims' weakening cries for mercy. These sounds became the nightly soundtrack of the camp. Those who survived the initial butchering would be thrown into a ditch where they would slowly bleed to death, their moans growing weaker until blessed silence finally came. The stench of the camp was indescribable. The metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the sweet, cloying odor of rotting flesh. Cooking fires sent the smell of burning human meat drifting through the jungle, a smell that survivors said was unmistakably different from any animal they had ever encountered. Flies swarmed in black clouds so thick they obscured vision. The buzzing was constant, maddening, punctuated only by the screams from the killing hut and the crackling of cooking fires. Among the most overlooked victims of Japanese cannibalism were the soldiers of the British Indian Army. 2 million Indians served in World War II, and thousands became prisoners of war. Their testimonies, buried in classified files for decades, reveal some of the most systematic and prolonged cannibalism of the entire war. Corporal Chandy Ram of the 2nd 15th Punjab Regiment was captured at Kuching on December 27, 1941. His testimony, given to war crimes investigators, provides a first-hand account of the methodical brutality inflicted on Indian prisoners. At the Kuala Belait camp in Brunei, Indian prisoners were worked to death building airfields and military installations. Those too weak to work were beaten with leather belts, steel pipes, and rifle butts. The sound of leather striking flesh, the crack of breaking bones, the wet thud of bodies hitting the ground, these became daily occurrences. Ram recalled the distinctive sound of Japanese boots on wooden floors as guards approached the prisoners' quarters. That sound meant someone was about to be beaten, tortured, or worse. The Japanese tried repeatedly to convert Indian prisoners to their cause, forming them into the Indian National Army to fight against the British. When the Indians refused, Their rations were cut to a handful of rice per day. The sound of empty stomachs growling became constant background noise in the camps. On June 13, 1945, the Japanese implemented their final solution for the Indian prisoners at Kuala Belait. 65 Indian soldiers were ordered to fall in formation. What happened next was swift and brutal. The sound of bayonets being fixed to rifles, the sharp intake of breath from men who knew they were about to die, the wet thud of blades entering flesh. Within minutes, all 65 Indians had been bayonet or beheaded. Ram survived only by hiding in the jungle undergrowth, listening to his comrades' death cries echoing through the trees. When he emerged the next morning, he found a scene of systematic slaughter. 65 headless bodies arranged in neat rows, their blood soaking into the jungle floor. The most damning evidence of institutional knowledge came in the form of a secret Imperial Army order dated November 18, 1944. This document, discovered after the war, directly addressed the problem of Japanese troops engaging in cannibalism. The order didn't condemn cannibalism outright. Instead, it specified that eating fellow Japanese soldiers was punishable by death, but consuming enemy flesh was acceptable. The document referred to cannibalism as the worst human crime due to lack of thoroughness in moral training, but only when applied to eating one's own countrymen. This official sanction of cannibalism against enemies reveals that these were not isolated incidents by rogue soldiers, but part of a broader institutional acceptance of the practice. After the war, many Japanese officers and soldiers were tried for war crimes and executed, but the full extent of cannibalism in the Pacific Theater was systematically covered up by the Japanese government. Today, this history cannot be taught in Japanese schools or discussed publicly. It's deemed too sensitive. Japanese historians who wish to research and publish accurate accounts of these atrocities must leave Japan to do so, finding positions at universities in Australia and other countries where academic freedom allows them to document the truth. The cannibalism practiced by Japanese forces during World War II was not the product of a cannibalistic culture. It was the result of military indoctrination, desperate circumstances, and the complete breakdown of moral constraints during wartime. These were not isolated incidents by a few rogue soldiers. They were systematic, widespread, and in some cases officially sanctioned practices that resulted in the deaths and consumption of hundreds, possibly thousands, of Allied prisoners and civilians. The sounds and smells of these camps, the screams of victims, the crack of breaking bones, the sizzle of human flesh over cooking fires, the overwhelming stench of death and decay, haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Today, these stories remain largely forgotten, buried in classified files and suppressed by governments unwilling to confront the full horror of what happened in the Pacific Theater. That's where World War IIpedia comes in, to tell these forgotten stories of World War II, to uncover the testimonies that were buried, and to ensure these voices are finally heard. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe to our channel where we continue to bring you the untold histories that shaped our world. War, as they say, is hell. But what happened in these camps went beyond war. It was a descent into a darkness that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The men who survived these horrors carried the sounds and smells of the camps with them forever. Their testimonies stand as a reminder that in the extremes of human conflict, the line between civilization and savagery can disappear entirely. We remember not to sensationalize their suffering, but to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. In the words carved into countless war memorials, lest we forget,